The sun rose over the burning remains of the frontier homestead, and its light fell across a land that felt stripped of every comfort and promise the young woman had ever known, and in that harsh glow she stood barefoot in the dust, staring at the charred beams that had once sheltered her family, and unsure if she was even awake or trapped in a strange, waking nightmare that refused to release her. Smoke drifted in thin, wavering lines toward the pale sky, and the air tasted of fear and the bitter memory of everything she had lost in a single night of fire and confusion. She knew that her father and mother were gone, for she had seen them fall, though her mind refused to shape the full memory, and every breath brought a new wave of disbelief that made her chest tighten with a weight she could hardly bear. Beside her stood her uncle, his face lined with exhaustion and desperation, for he had dragged her through the darkness, guiding her away from the raiders who had swept across the plains with fierce cries and swift horses. He had fought to keep her alive, but his strength was only enough to carry them this far, and now as morning hardened around them, he knew he had no way left to protect her from the dangers that waited beyond the ruins of their home. The land itself felt like a vast and merciless judge, stretching endless and silent under the widening sky. Their food was gone, their water nearly spent, their rifles empty, and the nearest town many days away through territory claimed by warriors who did not look kindly on those who crossed their path. Her uncle feared many things that day, but above all he feared that she would not survive another sunrise without something changing. In that moment, the faint thunder of hooves carried across the open land, and both of them turned to see a small band approaching with deliberate and measured speed. The riders moved as one unit, their bodies steady, their eyes unreadable, and their horses well-trained and proud. There was no chance to flee and no place to hide, so her uncle lifted a shaking hand in surrender, hoping for mercy yet expecting none. The Apache warriors circled them with calm precision, and the young woman felt her heart pound so fiercely she thought it might leap from her chest. The leading rider dismounted with a fluid motion that held neither anger nor haste, and stepped toward them with the quiet authority of someone who carried both burden and command. Her uncle bowed his head and spoke words that trembled even before they escaped his lips, for he knew that the only chance for her survival lay not in running, but in bargaining. Shame burned through him, yet the fear of losing her entirely pushed him forward. He explained that the girl was all that remained of their family, and that he himself had little strength left to keep her safe. The warrior listened without interrupting, his dark eyes steady and impossible to read. The young woman felt a cold wave of dread course through her, for she understood that strangers often made their own laws, and she had no voice in what might follow. The warrior finally spoke in a tone that felt carved from stone. There was no threat in his voice, yet also no softness. He said that his band had suffered losses during recent battles, and that the world was changing, forcing choices upon them whether they wished them or not. He said that taking the girl into their protection would require an exchange, and that by their customs such an exchange meant she would become part of their people, tied to them by responsibility and honor. Her uncle lowered himself to the ground, shaking with despair, for he knew the price, though he had prayed it would not come to this. With a voice barely strong enough to carry, he agreed to the terms, giving her into their keeping and begging only that they treat her with some measure of kindness. The young woman stood frozen, feeling the world tilt beneath her as though the earth itself had shifted. She wanted to shout, to protest, to run, to cling to anything familiar, but there was nothing left to grasp. The warrior approached her slowly, meeting her gaze with a calm that unsettled her far more than anger ever could. He said that by their law, she would be under his protection, and that no harm would come to her within his camp. His words should have soothed her, yet the weight of them settled heavily on her shoulders, for they marked the end of one life and the beginning of another she had never chosen. With a gesture he invited her to mount behind him on his horse, and she hesitated, staring back at her uncle, who could not meet her eyes, for his sorrow was too great. She stepped forward, driven not by trust but by the simple knowledge that she had nowhere else to go. When she placed her hand on the horse, the leather felt warm beneath her trembling fingers, and she climbed onto its back, trying to steady her breath as the band prepared to ride. As they moved across the plains, leaving the ruins behind her, she felt the last pieces of her old world fall away, and though fear clutched her heart, she sensed that this journey would shape her in ways she could not yet imagine. The Apache warrior, named Cantayel, did not speak much as he guided the young bride toward the distant rise of red stone cliffs. Every movement of his horse was smooth yet heavy, as if the weight on his shoulders went far beyond the habit of leading another captive. Through the wild lands, his silence was not the silence of cruelty, but of a man who carried storms inside himself, storms so old and so deep that words only stirred them. Instead of calming them, he was known among his people as the man who had seen too much. He had walked through fire and returned, though no one could truthfully say how his chest bore scars like pale rivers. Across earth worn by time and pain, his gaze held the memory of a family lost during a raid long ago, a memory that sometimes made him look toward the sky like a man asking for answers that never came to. The young bride, his quiet presence brought its own fear because she did not know him, she did not know his heart. She only knew she had been handed to him, and that truth alone breathed terror along her spine. She imagined he had taken her as spoils. She imagined he had claimed her because he wanted obedience or worse, yet as they rode farther she began to notice small things about the man beside her, and these small things started to confuse everything she had feared. He did not bind her hands, though his people had allowed it. He did not strike her when she stumbled or slowed. He spoke to his horse with a softness that surprised her, and when she nearly fell from the saddle, he reached out to steady her with a touch as brief as a falling leaf. All of this unsettled her thoughts because it did not match the story she had heard since childhood. Still, Cantayel was not gentle in a way she understood. He moved with the sharpness of a man who lived on the border between life and death. He watched everything as though danger breathed from every shadow and every gust of wind. His hand stayed near his weapon, not for her, but for whatever watched them. From the rocks and the trees, his world was shaped by battle and survival, and though he did not show anger, she could feel the iron of discipline in every line of his posture. When they finally reached the small rise overlooking the temporary Apache camp, the young bride felt her heart tighten. She expected taunts or glares or some fierce welcome of a captive taken and displayed. Instead, the people rose to greet Cantayel with respect. The elders touched his arm, the warriors nodded to him. Women whispered of his return, yet none reached for her, none dragged her away, none even looked upon her with hunger or cruelty. She saw then that Cantayel was not just another warrior. He was a man whose word held weight among his people, a man who had earned his place with both courage and sorrow. His tribe accepted her presence not with celebration, but with quiet understanding, because if Cantayel had brought her, then there must have been a reason. That night, as the firelight painted long shadows across the ground, she watched him from where she sat alone. She saw how he stood at the edge of the camp, aware of every sound, every movement, every spark of danger. She saw how he closed his eyes for a brief moment, as if gathering strength or letting go of some heavy memory. She wondered what loss had carved such depth into him, and why fate had placed her at the side of a man shaped by grief and silent honor. She feared him, yet she also sensed that his wounds might be the only reason she was still alive, for a warrior who had already lost so much might choose mercy in places where others would choose violence. And as the fire crackled softly, she realized that the man she feared might also be the only shield between her and a world that had already stolen everything from her. She woke before the sun barely touching the horizon, her body stiff from the cold night and the strange mattress that smelled of the desert and the smoke from the fire outside. She pulled the thin blanket tighter around her shoulders, feeling the weight of the new world that had been forced upon her. She could hear the warrior moving quietly across the lodge, his steps careful and deliberate, like a shadow that belonged to the walls. Alone, she wanted to call out, but the words stuck in her throat, fear and anger fighting for dominance in her chest. Every sound reminded her of her captivity, of the life she had lost. The farm, the small cabin, the morning chores that felt like freedom compared to the silence. And the watchful eyes that now surrounded her. The walls seemed taller than the mountains she had once seen, and the air carried a scent that was foreign. Dry and sharp, with hints of pine and smoke, she rose slowly, her legs stiff, her mind racing with thoughts of escape and of the stories her mother had whispered about women in the West who had faced danger and survived. She moved to the small window and peered outside. The desert stretched endlessly, her eyes trying to find the path that could lead her back to the world she had known. The rocks and the low brush offered no comfort, only the reminder that running would not be simple. The warrior appeared at the doorway, his silhouette strong and silent. He did not speak, only nodded toward the fire, indicating that it was time to eat. She sat on the mat, feeling the hunger gnawing at her stomach, yet hesitant to reach for the food, as if accepting it meant surrendering another piece of herself. He waited patiently, watching her with eyes that held both power and restraint. She wondered what he thought of her, whether he saw only a frightened girl or something more stubborn and alive than she believed herself to be. Every gesture of his was careful, deliberate, teaching her about this new life. Without words, guiding her hand to the bowl, showing her how to move. Without fear, from one side of the lodge to the other, she felt the tension in her muscles slowly uncoil, as if learning the rhythm of this strange home was the first step to surviving it. Yet anger still burned bright inside her at those who had sold her, at the world that had left her with no choice. She clenched her fists under the table, wishing for strength, wishing for courage to face the days ahead. She remembered the stories her father told of warriors who could be both kind and deadly. She realized that the man before her embodied both qualities, and that her life now depended on understanding the rules of this land. The warrior spoke finally, his voice low and steady, not a command, but an explanation of the duties expected in the camp. She listened carefully, each word shaping her thoughts, each gesture revealing the unspoken rules of survival. She began to notice how the other women in the lodge moved, how the children laughed, and how even the men carried themselves with a pride she had never seen before. The desert sun rose higher, warming the lodge through the small cracks in the walls. She felt the heat on her skin, a reminder that life outside the shadows continued to move. Whether she was ready or not, she knew she had to make choices that would define her new existence, and that anger and fear alone would not be enough to keep her safe. She took a deep breath, feeling the first hint of resolve settle in her chest. She would survive, she would endure, she would watch and learn, and perhaps in time she would find a way to reclaim a small piece of the freedom that had been stolen from her. For now, she would listen, she would move carefully, and she would keep her mind sharp as the world outside continued to challenge her spirit, and the warrior remained her silent companion. A presence that was both frightening and oddly reassuring, a shadow she could neither fully trust nor fully reject, yet one she could not ignore. As the day stretched on, she realized that her fight was not just against the land or the people around her, but against the despair that threatened to take root inside her, and she promised herself that she would not let it, she would not bend completely, she would find the strength to endure. And in this moment of quiet determination, she felt the first stirrings of a resilience she did not yet fully understand. Day wore on, with the sun climbing higher and the heat pressing down on the lodge walls. She moved carefully around the fire, watching the other women and children work with a rhythm that was strange yet oddly comforting. She felt the weight of every glance and every whispered word, as if they were measuring her worth and testing her resolve. She wanted to speak, yet the words tangled in her throat, and when she tried to form a question, it came out as a croak that made her cheeks burn with shame. The warrior sat nearby, his eyes never leaving her, a quiet presence that both unnerved and reassured her. She realized that his patience was a weapon as sharp as any blade, and that understanding him could mean the difference between survival and disaster. She noticed how he moved when he went to check the horses outside, The careful way he handled the reins, the quiet authority that made the animals obey without struggle. She remembered her father riding the horses back home and the freedom she had felt on their backs, and a pang of longing tore through her chest, a longing for the life she had lost and a life she might never reclaim. The children ran past laughing, chasing a small dog that yipped and darted between their feet. She almost smiled at the sound, but fear held her back. She did not know if smiling would be accepted, if it would mark her as weak or foolish. She felt the tension in her muscles grow, and she clenched her fist to remind herself to remain alert. The warrior returned, and the dog skittered away from him. Without a sound he nodded to the children, and they froze, then relaxed as if acknowledging some silent command. She watched him, and realized that power in this place was quiet. It was in knowing when to act and when to wait. It was in restraint and observation, not in shouting or force. She thought about the men who had come to take her and the fury that had burned in their eyes, and shivered at the contrast of the calm yet deadly presence of the warrior before her. She began to understand that fear could be a tool and restraint could be a shield, and perhaps the man had given her more protection by holding back than the others could have given by seizing. She remembered the small mirror she had found in her bundle and touched her face. Her skin pale from the long ride, her eyes wide with exhaustion and fear. She studied her reflection and saw a mixture of defiance and vulnerability that mirrored the tension in her chest. She wanted to scream, to throw herself against the walls of the lodge and demand freedom, but she knew that action now would bring only punishment and perhaps despair. She would wait, she would learn, and she would endure the routines of the camp. As the day slid into afternoon, the sun casting long shadows across the floorboards, she felt the weight of the world pressing down and a strange sense of determination rising with it. She watched the women weaving baskets and preparing food, their hands steady and unhurried, and began to mimic their movements with care and precision, each motion grounding her in the present and giving her a sense of control that she had not felt since the raid that had taken everything from her. She felt the warrior's eyes on her, and met his gaze for the first time without flinching, and in that brief moment a silent understanding passed between them that neither spoke of, but both acknowledged. She realized that surviving this place would require more than strength and fear. It would require patience, courage, and an understanding of the strange rules that governed the lives around her. The sun dipped lower and the air cooled, bringing the first whisper of evening. She prepared to follow the women to gather water from the nearby stream, a task that seemed simple, yet carried hidden dangers in the shifting sands and the eyes that watched from a distance. She took a deep breath, feeling the tension in her shoulders ease slightly as she stepped outside and felt the desert wind on her skin for the first time, as if it were a signal that she could endure, that she could survive, and that perhaps one day she would find a way to carve out a life in this world that had been forced upon her. And as she walked beside the women, she kept her head high, her steps measured and careful, learning the rhythms of the camp and of the warrior who had become an inescapable presence in her life, a presence that frightened her even as it promised safety. The days blended together, and the rhythms of the camp began to seep into her consciousness. She watched the women grind corn and weave mats, and she tried to mimic their movements as best she could, though every motion felt foreign and clumsy. She felt the eyes of the children on her and wondered if they judged her silently as an intruder or merely observed her as a curiosity. The warrior remained nearby, always present, never intrusive, his gaze like a shadow that followed her quietly through the lodge and across the open spaces of the camp. She could feel the weight of his attention, and it made her restless and uneasy. She longed for the freedom of speaking without caution and moving without thought, yet every gesture reminded her that she was a guest in a world she barely understood. The sun rose high, and the heat pressed down on her skin, making her sweat in places she had never imagined could sweat. She tried to keep pace with the women as they carried water and prepared food, and she stumbled over the rocks on the way to the stream, cursing silently at her own clumsiness and the strength that seemed to be demanded by the earth itself. she realized that surviving here would require more than obedience. It would require understanding, patience, and the ability to read the unspoken rules that governed each glance and movement. She noticed how the warrior watched her from a distance, his eyes not critical but observant, and she began to understand that he measured her in ways that she could not decipher, yet his attention made her heart beat faster with a strange mixture of fear and curiosity. She remembered her life before the raid, the soft mornings in the garden, the smell of fresh bread, her mother's voice calling her for breakfast, and she felt a pang of grief for the world she had lost, yet at the same time, she could not deny the pull of this new life, a strange sense of belonging that came from being among people who lived with such intensity and purpose. She tried to speak to the women, asking questions in a halting voice, and they responded with nods and gestures that taught her more than words could, and she realized that language was only one part of understanding, and that the rhythms of work and care and movement were another form of speech altogether. The warrior approached during the afternoon as the shadows lengthened and the light softened. His presence made her tense, yet she did not look away. He handed her a small bundle of herbs and taught her how to crush and mix them for pain or to soothe the small aches from laboring under the sun. She listened, carefully trying to commit every movement to memory, and she felt a small sense of accomplishment that made her chest swell with pride. The sun began to dip behind the low hills, casting golden light across the camp. She followed the women to the stream, the water cool and clear, and felt it wash over her hands and arms, a sensation she had almost forgotten. As she watched the reflections of the trees and sky, she felt a quiet peace that was foreign yet welcome. The warrior remained near, yet silent, and she realized that his restraint was part of the lesson. He wanted her to learn the rules of survival and endurance, and perhaps the rules of trust in a place where both could mean life or death. She felt a flicker of curiosity about him, a desire to understand what shaped the man who could be so gentle yet so commanding at the same time. She remembered the whispers of the other women about the warriors and the dangers of the desert, and she realized that he was not merely a protector. He was a guide and a force she could not ignore. She returned to the lodge as the sky darkened and stars began to pierce the night. The children slept quietly. The women whispered around the fire, and she felt the strange tension of being both intruder and student in a world she barely understood, yet a world that was beginning to claim her slowly and insistently. She sat near the fire and watched the flames dance, feeling the warmth on her face and hands. She thought about the warrior, about the lessons he had taught silently, about the movements and care and respect that formed the fabric of this life, and she understood that the survival she sought required more than strength. It required awareness, patience, and a willingness to accept a world that was both beautiful and dangerous. And as she closed her eyes that night, she felt the first true understanding of what it meant to be part of something larger than herself, to be a guest in a world that demanded more than she had ever known and yet promised more than she had ever imagined. The morning arrived hot and dry and heavy with the scent of dust and sage. She woke before the sun and felt the tension in her muscles from the previous day. The warrior was already awake, moving quietly through the lodge, checking the animals and the supplies. She watched him from the shadows, learning the subtle movements that marked strength and caution in this new world. She tried to mimic his patience and care in small ways, touching the grain, carefully arranging the blankets, folding the small bundle of herbs she had learned to make. Yet she felt a constant edge of fear and vigilance, as if danger could appear at any moment, and perhaps it could. She remembered the stories of raiding parties and soldiers moving through the desert, and she realized that the world she had known was gone forever. The women began their daily work, and she joined them, carrying water, preparing food, weaving mats. She stumbled often, but they never mocked, only corrected gently, and she felt a small sense of belonging in the rhythm of labor that contrasted with the chaos that had seized her life. The warrior moved among the men, checking the horses and the perimeter of the camp, his presence commanding, yet quiet. She watched him and noticed how each motion was measured, each glance deliberate, and she wondered if he sensed the danger that always lingered beyond the visible edges of the camp, or if he had trained himself to anticipate it. The sun climbed higher and the heat pressed down, yet she felt the stirrings of awareness growing inside her, an understanding of the patterns of life here that could protect her if she remembered them. If she acted carefully, she moved to the edge of the camp, gathering herbs with the other women, and felt the eyes of the warrior on her from across the fire. She met his gaze for a fleeting moment and felt a strange mix of fear and curiosity that made her stomach tighten as she worked. She realized that her survival depended not just on avoiding danger, but on understanding the people around her. The men and women and children each had a role, and each expected her to learn hers quickly, and she could feel the weight of their scrutiny and the unspoken rules that governed even small gestures. The afternoon brought a distant rumble of hooves and a whisper among the children of strangers approaching. She froze her heart, hammering as the women hushed the younger ones, and the warrior moved immediately to the edge of the camp, assessing the threat silently and efficiently. She followed cautiously, staying low and unseen, and felt the tension coil inside her like a spring ready to snap. The riders appeared, silhouetted against the shimmering heat of the desert, a small band that might have been traders or raiders. She could not tell yet. The fear in the camp was palpable. The warrior signaled for silence, and the men prepared. Quietly, she felt her hands sweat as she crouched behind a low wall and realized how helpless she was in this situation, dependent entirely on the man whose presence had become both a comfort and a terror in itself. The riders came closer, and she heard a sharp command from the warrior, and the camp sprang into practiced motion. The horses were led to safety, the children moved to hiding spots, the women worked with quiet efficiency, and she followed the patterns she had learned, trying not to stumble as the threat drew near, yet never fully revealing themselves. The riders passed by with only a shout and a wave from the lead man, yet the tension lingered as the camp slowly exhaled. She realized that danger was never far in this land, and that survival required constant attention, awareness, and trust in those around her. She returned to the lodge with the other women, exhausted and trembling, and the warrior approached, silently offering water and a nod that seemed to say, "You did well." She took it gratefully, feeling the strange bond of shared endurance and silent communication between them. As night fell and the stars pierced the desert sky, she thought of the fleeting danger of the day and the lessons hidden in it about patience, awareness, and resilience, and she realized that the warrior was teaching her not with words but with presence, with observation, and that this lesson was more valuable than anything she had learned before. In the quiet of the night, she lay awake thinking of the desert, the riders, and the man who had become her protector, and she knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new lessons, and new choices that would test the limits of her strength and courage. The morning broke with a pale light spilling across the desert, and she woke feeling the weight of yesterday's events pressing on her chest. The camp was quieter than usual, and the air heavy with anticipation. She moved carefully to the small fire where the women were preparing food, trying to keep her hands steady and her mind focused. She remembered the riders from the previous day and the fear that had tightened her stomach, and she realized that survival was not just about avoiding danger, but about anticipating it, learning to see it before it arrived, and reacting with calm and purpose. The warrior appeared at the edge of the lodge, watching silently as she moved among the other women. She felt the tension rise inside her, as if his gaze could pierce through her thoughts, and he nodded briefly, acknowledging the small confidence she had shown yesterday. She took it as a signal that she was beginning to understand the unspoken rules of the camp, yet fear still lingered. Like a shadow in the corners of her mind, the men gathered quietly to discuss patrols and routes through the desert, and she listened, without speaking, trying to absorb everything about how they assessed threats and prepared for the unknown. She realized that knowledge could be as powerful as strength if wielded correctly, and she felt a small surge of determination to learn everything she could. The afternoon brought a decision she had been anticipating, yet dreading, a choice that would define her in ways she could not yet see. The warrior approached and told her in quiet words that she could choose to accompany a small group to gather provisions or remain in the lodge with the children and women, she froze, her heart hammering. In her chest, the thought of leaving the relative safety of the lodge filled her with fear, yet staying behind felt like yielding to inertia and fear itself. She took a deep breath and nodded in understanding. She would go with the group, feeling the strange mixture of terror and excitement rising inside her. She learned quickly as they moved across the desert, noticing the small signs, the shift of shadows, the subtle changes in the wind and the direction of the tracks. She felt her senses sharpen with every step and realized that the world outside the camp demanded constant awareness and respect. The warrior walked beside her, guiding silently yet never overtly controlling, allowing her to make choices while correcting mistakes with gentle nudges or quiet signals. She stumbled on a loose rock and he caught her arm effortlessly, and she felt a thrill of gratitude and something else, something unspoken, that made her cheeks warm. She tried to focus on the task at hand, collecting roots and small game, noting landmarks and water sources, yet her mind kept flickering to the way he moved, how he seemed to anticipate every danger yet never imposed himself fully, and she wondered what shaped a man who could be both protector and observer. And a storm of curiosity and admiration rose inside her as they moved. The sun climbed higher and the desert heat pressed down, making each movement a challenge, yet she felt stronger with every step, knowing that she had chosen to face the unknown and not remain hidden behind the walls of the lodge. She realized that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to move forward despite it. The days stretched long and the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the Pate Adama sands, and when they returned to the camp, she felt a quiet pride at having completed the task despite her apprehension. The warrior nodded once more, his eyes meeting hers, and in that brief glance she felt the first stirrings of respect, not just for him but for herself, for the strength she had found when she had the courage to choose. And as night fell and the camp settled into quiet routines, she lay awake thinking of the desert, the sun, the sand, and the man who had become both guide and mirror, reflecting the potential she had yet to realize. And she understood that the choices she made now would shape not just her survival, but the woman she was becoming, and that perhaps in time she would find a place in this harsh and beautiful land where fear and courage walked side by side. The morning came with a sharp wind blowing across the desert, and she woke to whispers and hurried movements in the camp. The air felt electric with tension, and her heart tightened as she tried to discern the cause. She moved carefully through the lodge, noticing the women speaking in low tones and the children huddled close to them. She caught sight of the warrior at the edge of the camp, standing with his back straight and eyes scanning the horizon. He noticed her glance and gave a slight nod as if to say, "Be ready, but do not act." Yet she followed him silently to the outer edge, where the men were gathered discussing the latest rumors of rival bands moving through the desert. The details were fragmented and alarming, threats that could come without warning or mercy, and she realized how fragile their safety was in a land ruled by unpredictability. Yet the warrior spoke quietly to the group, giving instructions that were calm, precise, and authoritative, and she marveled at how he commanded respect without raising his voice, how every motion and gesture seemed deliberate and necessary. The rest of the day passed with a tense vigilance as scouts were sent out and the camp prepared for potential attack. She helped in small ways, carrying water, checking bundles, and observing the routines she had been taught, noticing how every small action contributed to the safety of the whole. The warrior moved among the men and women with a quiet authority that made her chest ache with admiration and unease. She realized that part of her fear was the intensity of his presence, and part was the growing sense of dependence she felt on him. The sun climbed high and shadows lengthened, and she watched as a rider approached from the horizon, alone, a messenger bringing news that a rival faction had been spotted near a trading post some miles to the north. The warrior received the news calmly, yet his eyes hardened, and he immediately organized a small party to assess the threat. He turned to her briefly, and said you will remain in the lodge safe with the others, and she nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat, wishing she could do more, yet understanding the risk of venturing into unknown danger. She returned to the lodge and worked silently beside the women, preparing food and checking on the children, trying to keep her mind steady as the hours dragged on, each moment stretching with anticipation. She felt the weight of waiting heavy on her shoulders. The afternoon brought a sudden flurry of movement, men riding toward the camp, and her heart jumped as she realized the rival faction had altered course and was heading closer than expected. The warrior returned quickly, his eyes sharp and calculating, and he directed the men to prepare defenses, positioning women and children in the safest spots while keeping a calm voice. She followed orders, moving bundles and guiding the children, quietly wishing she could act as boldly as he did, yet feeling the sting of her own limitations. The sun dipped low and the sky turned a burning orange, casting long shadows across the camp. She heard the first distant shouts and the clang of metal, and realized that the battle was near, yet she felt a strange clarity in the midst of fear, remembering every lesson, every small task she had been taught, and seeing the precision of the warriors' leadership. She understood that courage was a skill as much as a feeling, and that preparedness and observation could save lives. The rival faction passed by the outer edges of the camp, clashing with scouts briefly, but moving on without breaching the defenses, and the camp exhaled as tension loosened slightly. She felt mixture of relief and lingering fear, her body trembling with adrenaline. The warrior returned to the lodge and for the first time spoke directly to her about what had happened, his voice calm yet edged with something unspoken, and she felt the bond of trust deepen silently between them. She realized that survival in this land required not just strength but alliances and understanding, and that the warrior had become her anchor and guide in a world that demanded constant vigilance. As night fell, she lay awake thinking of the day the near attack, the desert, the rival factions, and the man whose presence had kept her safe. And she understood that trust was fragile and precious, and that in this harsh land it could mean the difference between life and death. The morning arrived quiet and pale, and she woke feeling a tension in her chest that had nothing to do with the rising sun. She moved carefully through the lodge, noticing the women already engaged in their work and the children whispering softly to one another. The warrior sat near the fire, observing the camp silently, yet his eyes seemed to carry a question she could not yet answer. She prepared the water and checked the bundles, moving with the rhythm she had learned over the past days, trying to steady her hands and her thoughts. She thought of the previous day, the rival faction, the near clash, the way the warrior had guided everyone with calm authority, and she realized that the lessons she had been given were not only about survival but about understanding her own strength and place in this world. The sun climbed higher and the desert air grew warmer, yet she felt a growing determination rising within her. She would no longer be only a passive observer. She would make a choice that mattered for herself and for the camp. She moved to the edge of the lodge where the warrior stood and took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing heart. She spoke quietly in the voice she had been practicing in her mind. I want to help, I want to learn, I want to make decisions, not only follow orders. The warrior looked at her silently, his eyes sharp and searching, as if weighing the courage and sincerity behind her words. He nodded once and stepped aside, allowing her to join the men preparing for a scouting trip to check the northern trails. She felt a surge of pride mixed with fear as she gathered her supplies and followed the small group into the desert. The wind was hot against her skin, the sand shifting beneath her boots, and each step reminded her of how far she had come from the frightened girl who had arrived at the camp. She noticed the small signs along the trail, the tracks of animals, the faint impressions left by travelers, and the subtle shifts in the wind, and she realized that her awareness had grown sharper than she had thought possible. The warrior walked beside her, offering guidance without overt control, and she felt the strange bond of trust and respect solidifying between them. As they moved through the desert, she spotted evidence of recent activity that the men had missed and pointed it out quietly, her voice steady and calm for the first time, and the warrior looked at her with something close to admiration in his eyes. She realized that she had earned a voice in this world not by demanding it, but by observing and acting with care and intelligence. The scouting trip continued with small discoveries and careful navigation. She made choices about which paths to follow, which signs to track, and the men began to notice her growing confidence and insight. As the sun climbed higher and the heat pressed down, she felt a thrill of accomplishment mingled with exhaustion, yet she also felt a sense of belonging. In a way that had seemed impossible at first, her heart beat faster when she looked at the warrior and saw that he had recognized her courage and independence without a word being exchanged. The day drew to a close, and the camp welcomed their return. With quiet relief, she felt the eyes of the women and children on her and understood that she had changed not only herself, but their perception of her too. She walked toward the lodge, her steps measured and deliberate, and the warrior met her gaze with a nod that spoke volumes about respect, trust, and the silent acknowledgement of her choice. She knew that her voice now mattered, that her actions could shape her own fate and the fate of those around her, and she felt a deep sense of satisfaction, mingled with a lingering awareness of the dangers that still existed in the desert. Yet for the first time she realized that fear did not have to control her. That courage was a choice she could make every day, and as night fell and the stars pierced the sky, she lay awake thinking of the desert, the sun, the warriors, the rival factions, and the path she had chosen, and she understood that survival was only the beginning, and that the woman she was becoming would define the future she had yet to embrace. The dawn broke pale and golden across the desert, and she woke feeling a quiet strength in her chest unlike anything she had known before. She moved through the lodge, noticing the women preparing food and the children whispering and laughing softly, and she felt a sense of belonging she had never imagined possible. The warrior stood at the edge of the camp, his gaze sweeping the horizon, and for a moment their eyes met, and she felt a silent acknowledgement of all that had passed and all that they had endured together. She prepared herself for the day ahead, knowing that it would require courage, observation, and careful choice. The camp was alive with movement, yet beneath it lingered the tension of the desert, the knowledge that danger could appear at any moment and that every decision mattered. She moved among the women, carrying water, arranging supplies, and guiding the children. Her hands steady, her mind alert, and every motion deliberate. She realized that she no longer feared the weight of responsibility, but welcomed it as proof of her growth. The warrior approached her silently, offering a small bundle of herbs and a nod, and she accepted it, gratefully feeling the quiet bond of trust between them solidified by days of shared trials and unspoken understanding. As the sun climbed higher, a rider appeared on the horizon, bringing news that a small group of traders was stranded nearby. She volunteered to accompany a rescue party, and the warrior assessed her quietly, his eyes sharp and searching, before giving a brief nod and stepping aside, allowing her to choose this path. She felt a thrill of pride mixed with fear, yet she embraced it, knowing that she had earned this place in the camp and among the people she had come to respect and care for. The journey across the desert was arduous, the sand shifting beneath her boots, the sun burning on her skin. Yet she moved with awareness and purpose, noticing the signs and tracks that revealed the condition and location of the stranded traders. She guided the group with confidence, making decisions carefully, and quickly the warrior stayed nearby, observing her silently, offering advice only when necessary, and she realized that he had trained her not by shielding her from the world, but by teaching her to face it with courage and intelligence. When they reached the traders, she coordinated their safe return to the camp, directing the men and women efficiently and calmly, and she felt a surge of pride at having contributed something meaningful to the safety and survival of the group. As they returned to the camp, the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the desert, and the camp greeted them with quiet relief. She walked toward the lodge, her steps confident and measured, and felt the eyes of the women and children on her, seeing respect in their gaze and gratitude in their expressions. The warrior approached and for the first time spoke directly to her about the journey and her role in it. His voice calm yet filled with a rare warmth. He told her that she had shown courage, intelligence, and independence, that she had proven herself in ways he had not expected, and she felt the swell of pride and belonging in her chest. A new chapter of trust had been forged between them that required neither words nor promises, only acknowledgement of shared endurance and choice. As night fell and stars pierced the desert sky, she sat near the fire, the warmth of the flames on her face and hands, and felt a quiet peace she had never known before. The desert had tested her fear, courage, and resilience, and she had emerged stronger, wiser, and aware of her own strength. She looked at the warrior and understood that their bond was built on respect, choice, and survival, not fear or obligation, and she realized that she had found a place in this harsh and beautiful land, a place where she could grow, protect others, and live on her own terms. And as she lay down that night beneath the endless sky, she felt the first true sense of freedom, not in escaping the desert, but in embracing it and herself, in choosing courage over fear, and in knowing that she had earned her life and her voice, and perhaps one day the heart of the man who had guided her with patience, restraint, and honor.